Don't be fooled. Things are not what they seem. This is no ordinary celebration.
If this finger goes, obviously this one should be able to go as well. If this one comes back, this one goes. If that one goes, the last one's just got to go. But of course, that's impossible. It's called sleight of hand, by the way.
Gathered here are some of the most intriguing people I've ever met. And they're all here to celebrate a modest, self-effacing writer, Martin Gardner. This is a story of the web of relations woven around him, a web of mystery, magic, and paradox. In Martin's world, everyone plays more than one role. There are acrobats who are mathematicians, and magicians who investigate the things that go bump in the night.
The way that it appears to do absolutely remarkable things. Now, just by stroking it gently like this and doing a little bit of simple manipulation, you see it almost, the illusion is very strong. It appears as if it's getting flexible.
These are just a few of the extraordinary people who've been brought together by Martin and his writings.
How hard could it be, right?
All right, the first time I saw Martin Gardner was at the Morrison Hotel in Chicago. And he was demonstrating a trick that he'd invented called the passy-passy sponges. And what he did was he covered each sponge with the back of his hand, and then one in the left hand, one in the right hand, and by doing that, it fooled me pretty badly.
My main interest in magic is because it arouses a sense of wonder about how things operate, about the natural world. The universe is almost like a huge magic trick, and scientists are trying to figure out how it does what it does.
This, I'm sure, was in Martin's column sometime. It's impossible to tie a knot without leaving go of the ends of the string the way I just did. But Martin will tell you many different ways of doing it.
There was one day where I got a letter from Martin that said, try putting marshmallows in a vacuum. What do you think will happen? When Martin tells you to do something, it's going to be interesting and that the results are going to be kind of counterintuitive. So if we now pump all the air out of this, what happens is that the marshmallows actually get larger instead of smaller. Now, if you let all the air back in, that's when they shrink down even smaller than when we started. So what's appealing about this is that it's this goofy thing to look at, but it really teaches you an interesting lesson in science, and there's something really kind of magical about watching these things get bigger. In fact, you can see how big they were when we started. Just kidding.
You see me writing Gardner from back to front, and I'm actually looking at Martin being written from left to right.
Martin Gardner is sort of at the center of this huge collection of intersecting sets. Mathematics and magic and puzzles and logic and linguistics and philosophy, theology, skepticism, and I'm certainly leaving out lots of things. But the point is that they all intersect on this one fascinating guy.
Countless times I've met some person who's told me that they became interested in mathematics and, now they're a professor of mathematics or something, through reading Martin Gardner's columns.
I didn't take any math in college. And I don't consider myself a mathematician in any real creative sense. I'm strictly a journalist who writes about what the real mathematicians say.
Years later, I saw him take a roll at a table, and he took the roll and which surprised me.
It's strictly been a hobby with me. I've never been a performer. The closest I ever came to getting paid for magic was when I was at the University of Chicago. During the Christmas season, I demonstrated magic sets at Marshall Fields.
To know that Martin's career as a performer was more extensive than that, you just have to see him in these black and white shorts made for early television.
Once you corral a man, gals, don't let him get away. Tie his wrists with a handkerchief, loop a rope around it, and lead him off. Oops, she loses more men that way. Nothing wrong with that knot, but watch his fingers as we view him from another angle. He grabs the rope with his fingertips, draws it forward, slips it over his right hand. It pulls out behind the handkerchief. Okay, try to get out of this one.
In Martin's web, it's no more unusual to find an engineer who designs puzzles than a mathematician who is also a dancer. But then there are some like Scott Kim, whose skills can prove difficult to categorize.
The emphasis is math you can do with your body. So here's an example. This is the first shape. This was inspired by a lecture about Buckminster Fuller. This shape is called a tetrahedron. It's 4 triangles. The last time I visited Martin, I showed him some of these hand games, and he liked them, so I took it as a sign that I should keep pursuing it. Here's how to make a cube with your fingers. And here's how to tie an overhand knot with your fingers. The thing I was most curious about when I went to see Martin Gardner was, what does his filing system look like? He's the world's best correspondent. Everybody will tell you that. He responds to everybody's letters quickly, briefly, with enthusiasm, and he usually tells you about somebody else doing something related. How could he keep track of all this?
So these are the famous Gardner files. What do you have in here?
I have no idea what are in these files now. And
Really?
that's right. I got a lot of letters from mathematicians I didn't even understand, but they were related to a column, so they got filed here. Well, these books are on mathematics.
Martin has not only written books on mathematics, puzzles, and magic. He's also written books on physics, philosophy, religion, literature, numerous magazine articles, short stories, volumes of poetry for children, and even a semi-autobiographical novel. Throughout his writings runs a playfulness and an intellectual curiosity that attracted leading scientists to his column in the magazine Scientific American. There, every month for 25 years, he brought his readers mathematics and much more. The first of these columns featured the hexaflexagon, a three-dimensional paper puzzle that unfolds in surprising patterns.
Well, this was the structure that was the topic of my first Scientific American column, and it's a very peculiar structure. It's made from one long strip, and it's just folded in a peculiar way, and then the ends are pasted together. Topologically, it's a Möbius strip. There were people all over New York who were making hexaflexagons out of paper and flexing them. And one interesting letter that they published in the following issue came from a reader who said he had made his hexaflexagon, and he was busy flexing it, and he caught the end of his necktie into the flexagon, and as he kept flexing it, he disappeared. The column on hexaflexagons had almost very little math in it. It was mathematical structure, but I didn't go into any details about it. But as you follow the columns, they get a little more sophisticated, and that's because I was learning math as I was writing it and reading books about it.
Martin's column, with its unique blend of math and whimsy, developed, and his network of fans and collaborators grew.
There it is.
Among them, Bill Gosper, a brilliant mathematician and legendary computer hacker.
Nice try, John.
This is Martin Gardner's greatest crime against the Western computer industry. He popularized a game in 1970 invented by John Conway called the Game of Life. And at the time, people didn't have PCs or even workstations. They just had mainframes where they worked. And in order to play this game, an enormous amount of computer time were stolen or otherwise wasted.
Conway called his game Life because it's governed by a few simple rules that determine how an initial configuration of dots grow, disappear, or persist. From simple beginnings, a few dots can transform into patterns of intricate beauty. It's a game with surprising consequences.
I mean, my life game can imitate any kind of computation you like. Moreover, any mathematical question of a certain kind, which really includes all the mathematical questions you think of, can be phrased as in the form, does such and such a life configuration fade away, say. So it's a simple little sort of metaphor, if you like, that encompasses essentially all of mathematics. And I knew it was a thing that Gardner would really love. I didn't realize quite how popular it would be.
Life became such a popular game among computer people around the country that millions of dollars were wasted. It was guessed in laboratories and big offices where computer people were spending all their time working on the Game of Life.
Martin's web is woven with the enthusiastic support of his many friends. Among them, Harvard mathematics professor Percy Diaconis.
Early on, he found John Conway, or John Conway found him, and I mean, you know, John Conway, the word genius gets misused an awful lot, and in these circles especially. John Conway's a genius.
Professor John Conway.
Conway was a creative genius.
One of the world's greatest living mathematicians.
Truly, I mean, Conway is one of the smartest dudes in the world.
Like many of Martin's circle, humor is part and parcel of Conway's approach to the serious business of science.
And then there's the cloverleaf.
It's perhaps revealing that when Conway read that only 1 in millions could do all 4 of these tongue tricks, he couldn't resist trying.
And I think probably the number of people who can do them all, I mean, do these exercises was wrongly stated there, because not many people were prepared to go to their bathroom mirror and spend an hour pulling tongues at it.
You know, John, ever since we met, you've shown me tricks and little puzzles. What is the relationship between fun math and serious math?
I'm a serious mathematician too. I've got a good job here. So I do some serious mathematics, but I also do games. And for me, they're very similar. You know, when you play a game, if you learn to be good at it, you find what it is you should have been thinking about. That's really rather subtle, you know. And that's what we do in mathematics. Puzzles, for instance. What are puzzles? There's something where you can do something that you didn't think you could do. You know, try doing this. Go on. Okay. And then bring this up like this, and take these index fingers, keep them crossed, and put your nose in. Keep them crossed, you're not crossing yours. Keep them crossed. It's a bit awkward, I know, and put your nose in there. And then relax, because the hard part's just about to come. You keep each finger touching the side of the nose that it now is, and do that. And the 4 people who've tried, none of them have been able to do that. That's a nice little trick. You want to see how to do that?
Sure.
Okay. Well, when I clasp my hands like that, I won't be able to do it. I actually reclasp like that.
Ron Graham is another of Martin's friends. He's an acrobat, a juggler, and chief scientist for AT&T Research.
So here is the fundamental juggling pattern. It's called the three-ball cascade. It kind of looks like this. Now you can put variations. There, one ball goes over, all balls go over. And this is the same trick that's kind of wrapped around, but it's all...
I asked him what all this playing around has to do with mathematics.
It's a shower. Mathematics is often called the science of patterns. And in juggling, you really work with patterns. You build up the complicated one from the simple one. Of course, there's a nice saying in juggling that the trouble with juggling is that the balls go where you throw them. And the same saying holds in computer programming. The problem with programming is the computer does exactly what you tell it. So a certain element of control, algorithms, pattern, and open-ended challenge. And these are kind of the connections that I see between math and juggling.
Saul Gollum was an important source of ideas for Martin's column. He's a professor of electrical engineering at the University of Southern California and a recreational math columnist in his own right.
Yeah, I'm frequently asked questions about recreational mathematics by people who have heard the term and have trouble understanding what it means. To many people, it sounds like an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms. How can mathematics be recreational? They've heard of recreational drugs and recreational sex, and somehow they don't see where mathematics would fit on the same scale. And to some extent, they're right. It's not recreational in that sense, because very often recreational mathematics is mathematics that has not yet found a more serious, in quotes, application. We don't ask that a work of art have an important practical application. You know, if you find some beautiful Greek statue, you don't ask, well, can you also use it to plow a field? That isn't what makes a work of art important. And mathematics, as much as anything, is an art form. So it shouldn't be required to be justified solely in terms of what practical applications it has.
I think my first interest in math was hooked by a book that my father got me called Sam Lloyd's Encyclopedia of Puzzles. And this was a collection of puzzles that Sam Lloyd, the famous American puzzlist, had contributed to periodicals and newspapers. And I loved that. I went through that. And I think that was my first real interest in math.
It's not surprising that a love of puzzles and an interest in mathematics could go hand in hand. But aren't magic and science just fundamentally opposed? Max Maven has thought deeply about that relationship.
Obviously, theatrical magic has to do with exploring the aesthetics of mystery. And there is an aesthetic side to mathematics which is inherently mysterious. So I think they go together very, very naturally.
Magician Michael Weber.
So the difference between the scientist and the magician is that the goal of the scientist is to reveal whatever that secret mechanism is that's at work. What makes it happen? How does it work? Whereas what the magician wants to do is find the same remarkable element, but conceal it so that what's produced instead of understanding is a mystery. And Martin always has had a wonderful sensitivity to this balance, where one chapter of his writings will be about revealing the remarkable characteristics or properties of a certain type of number, whereas the next chapter will be filled with things that we think we understand intuitively, and it turns out the results of all these things are counterintuitive. So he has a way of making puzzles very magical and magic very puzzling in a way that's remarkably appealing.
My interest in magic started with this particular trick that was shown to me by my father. He was not a magician, but he did this one trick, which he did on a pocket knife. And I was so intrigued by it that I began reading books on magic and trying to learn some more. And it starts out with 3 pieces of paper stuck with saliva on 2 sides of a knife, and you remove these one at a time. And finally, the last one. And that leaves it blank on both sides. And then this is the magic that brings it back again.
That's very nice.
Martin had a good sense of humor and a great sense of nonsense, which is, well, it's wonderful here. Closely allied to magic is something like fire-eating, sword-swallowing,
and metal taste lousiness.
Yes. That's the way it's done.
Martin's writings are full of magic, paradox, and impossibilities. One of his columns concerned a fictitious magician named Victor Eigen and an impossible object of his creation. Magician Michael Weber explains.
So what this was Victor Eigen reached into his desk and simply produced an impossible object. 2 rubber bands that had not been cut and glued back together, but that were impossibly linked together. And he was talking about these really interesting bands that were discovered by a mathematician named Mobius. The idea is that this band has a single surface. Well, what Martin then talked about is if you bisected it, and it's hard to say cut it in half because this is some object which is single-surfaced. It does something really nice here at the very end, because what you're left with is 2 parts of the original object which are linked together. So what's nice about that is taking that idea and understanding what Martin understood, and that is that rubber bands are these really kind of wonderful objects, and that people understand that they can't open up and go back together again, and that when they link together, it's a really impossible thing that's kind of interesting. So I'll show you with a small white one and a big purple one, and by pressing down, they link through each other, and they really do link, no cheating. And I'll turn just a tiny bit so you can see what this looks like from the backside, because some people are suspicious that these are twisted here at the top, but they're not. It's just one looped right through the other. And then when you pull up, they actually unlink right there in the center.
Here's a queen. Back in the deck she goes. The deck is cut several times. Now he's going to make that queen rise right up out of the pack like this. You don't think so? Watch. How it's done in a moment. In cutting the deck, be sure to keep the queen on top. Then it's simply a matter of using the little finger to raise her up above the other cards. Your queen, sir.
If you want to be in pi, you have to have done something your first time, some permutation eta.
Martin's influence has not been limited to his writings.
Pi eta inverse.
For some, like mathematician Percy Diaconis, it's been very direct and personal.
Undo it and get to pi the second time, and so
Diaconis is a much sought-after lecturer, but today's lecture is about a subject most of us would not associate with mathematics.
Why isn't the deck of cards random after shuffling it once? Okay, well, he cuts the top half. That's, say, 1 up to 26 if he happened to cut exactly in half. It's whatever is in the top half, right? And there's the bottom half. And he shuffles some way.
Today's subject is the mathematics of shuffling cards. It's a subject Professor Diaconis, almost a legend among magicians, knows very well. His dual careers as a mathematician and a magician are both intimately linked to Martin Gardner.
Martin's the reason I went back to college. I had dropped out of high school, actually, run away from home when I was 14 to go on the road doing magic. Certainly my interest in mathematics starts because of magic. That is, because of thinking about perfect shuffles and tricks with binary numbers and other things like that. And Martin's explaining to me, well, you know, you can understand that or develop a notation for it. Or if you didn't only want to do it with red and black cards, if you wanted to do it with the 4 suits, you'd have to change the trick. But you could figure out how that goes. All of that just opened up a world for me.
Percy was extremely skillful with cards, with very difficult sleights, such as dealing the second card instead of the top card, dealing the bottom card, what they call second deals and bottom deals, and false cuts and false shuffles and so on. And actually, at that time, he was paying his way through NYU by working as a gambler on ships that went back and forth between New York and South America. And, of course, nobody suspected this young teenage boy having this tremendous ability with cards.
Cards can be shuffled perfectly. That is 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, and what that involves is cutting the deck exactly in half and interweaving them together. And actually, it's a fact of nature or mathematics that it takes 8 shuffles to bring a deck back to where it started. That's surprising to people, and I still find it wonderful. They look as if they're being shuffled. One more, and I'm home. So that last shuffle, it should be that the cards are absolutely in order. I hope so. But it should be that all of the cards are. Yeah, it seems to have worked at least this time. Why would somebody be interested in doing that? Well, for example, if you were a gambler and you had 13 spades on top of the deck, so if here they are on top of the deck, and if I shuffle them perfectly, the spades are every other card. Okay. If I shuffle them perfectly again, they're every 4th card. So if I deal 4 bridge hands, I get all the spades. Okay. So you can understand that gamblers had a keen interest. And the first published literature about perfect shuffling, which is in the 1720s, is gamblers writing to warn other gamblers about people who were shuffling cards perfectly and stuff like that. And magicians also are interested in perfect shuffles because obviously you can do tricks.
I knew the head of the statistics department at Harvard because he was another magic buff who had contributed a lot of items to magic and had been on the cover of magic magazines. And so I wrote to him and said that there's this friend of mine who's just graduated at NYU and wants to get into the math department at Harvard, and could you help him out? And I said, by the way, he does the finest second deal of anybody that I've ever met.
Fred's one of the great expositors of statistics and serious statisticians. And he took Martin's letter seriously, and he said, Martin wouldn't say this unless it's true, and I think we should give this kid a chance. And over the, complaints of other people, because I wasn't very well prepared. My grades were lousy. You're going to take a kid in a graduate program who has C, C, and D as his calculus grades? I mean,
of course, they got along very well with the deck of cards between them, going over card magic and card sleights. So that's how Percy got into Harvard.
That only happened because of that link between Martin, mathematics, and magic, and Fred Mosteller. And Fred never told me that story until I graduated. And then afterwards, he said, I just want to tell you something, show you something. How'd you get into Harvard? And so, that's making a difference in somebody's life. And just knowing that the ace of spades is on the bottom, the distance to uniformity is equal to, 1 minus 1 over n.
It's not every high school dropout who ends up teaching at Harvard or having his lectures broadcast to mathematicians all over the world live on the internet. Martin Gardner's network requires neither modems nor fiber optic cables. What it lacks in technical sophistication is more than made up by its complex human interconnections. A senior member of that network is Professor Coxeter of the University of Toronto.
One of these was called intuition, and it involved putting together 3 hollow triangles, putting them together in the manner of Borromean rings. As you see here, for instance, the red triangle goes through the blue triangle, but if the yellow triangle were not there, you could pull them apart.
How did you first become acquainted with Martin Gardner?
I think it was through reading the little article he always had in the Scientific American on mathematical games. I found that was very intriguing. But then my popular book was published, Introduction to Geometry, and got in correspondence with him.
At a time when the Dutch artist M.C. Escher was virtually unknown in North America, Professor Coxeter used his works to illustrate certain problems in geometry. Because of Coxeter's influence, Martin dedicated a column to the art of M.C. Escher. The interactions between Coxeter, Escher, and Martin were to lead to results no one would have imagined.
How did you first learn about Escher?
I first heard about him from Professor Coxeter, a very famous geometer at the University of Toronto. And he put me in touch with Escher, and I wrote a column about him for Scientific American. And we exchanged quite a number of letters, and I asked him if he had any pictures for sale, and I bought this from him for $60. And that was before he became famous. The art critics don't care about his work at all, but mathematicians, of course, are enormously fond of Escher because his work ties up with so many interesting mathematical concepts.
One of those concepts that concerned Escher was what mathematicians call tiling the plane. That's the question of what shape tiles can fill a flat surface without gaps or overlaps. Obviously, square tiles can, and circular tiles can't. But what about more complex shapes? Escher's interest in this question is shared by mathematicians, crystallographers, and artisans. Professor Doris Schatzschneider is a mathematician, an Escher scholar, and a friend of Martin Gardner.
Escher seemed to be absolutely fascinated by tiling and by making up his own rules for tilings. They had to be creature shaped, they had to be recognizable, they had to be colored in such a way that each tile stood out by itself, and so on. And he worked out his own, what he called his layman's theory, and he discovered an enormous amount.
In the correspondence that he received about these articles on tiling was a letter that he forwarded to Professor Schatzschneider.
And in February 1976, he sent me something that had come in from Marjorie Rice in San Diego. I had no idea who she was.
Professor Schatzschneider was soon to discover that Marjorie Rice was no academic. She was a housewife who, along with her husband Gilbert, was raising 5 children in Southern California.
It wasn't until my senior year of high school that when I took a general mathematics course that I really found out how much I had been missing and how much I liked it. But I only had that 1 year and then I graduated.
Marjorie had purchased a subscription to Scientific American for her youngest son. But when she had finished her housework, she would turn her attention to Martin's column.
I first discovered my interest in this when Martin Gardner wrote about the 8 types of pentagon tiling in his column. And I thought, my, that must be wonderful that someone could discover these things which nobody had seen before, these beautiful patterns. So I started figuring out some way to work on the problem. I studied all of the types that were pictured in the articles and tried to discover a new type. And I was so delighted when I found it. I couldn't believe it. I didn't really think I would find anything. I just was so thrilled. And I sent it to Martin Gardner, and he sent it to Doris Schatzschneider.
Based on Marjorie's new tilings, Professor Schatzschneider proposed a rule about tilings in general. Though unschooled in higher math, Marjorie was able to prove the expert wrong by showing that this rule didn't hold.
Her proof was no proof like anything I had ever seen before. In fact, it was a series of pictures, all encoded with little marks. She did not use mathematical notation. She had little schematic pentagons drawn with little chicken track marks in them, and I really had no idea what all this meant. Finally, I figured out her intuition was exactly right, but she didn't have the mathematical tools to prove it herself. She ended up contributing to all kinds of new tilings by pentagons that had never been seen before. She seems just unstoppable. But her story really wouldn't exist if it hadn't been Martin Gardner's column.
Watch this, young lady. Fingertips on top of table. Table will follow the fingertips into the air, defying the laws of gravity and impressing an impressionable young miss. How it's done in a moment. It's magic, all right, but the table is helped along in its rise by a couple rulers the boys have stuck up their sleeves and under the table edge. You can choose a variety of weapons, but ordinary rulers will do.
Black. Red. Red. There's a very good reason why you haven't heard of my ability to detect color with my fingertips. It's because I cheat. Martin has a long-standing interest in cheating, in exposing fraudulent psychics, in crank science. He's one of the founding members of the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, or PSYCOP. James the Amazing Randi is also one of the founding members of PSYCOP and a longtime friend of Martin's.
This is a trick which was, now the way I do it is a trick, you see, it might be a divine miracle the way other people do it, but if you'll watch this very carefully, I'm going to show you that you can manipulate it in such a way that it appears to do absolutely remarkable things. Now, just by stroking it gently like this and doing a little bit of simple manipulation, you see it almost, the illusion is very strong. It appears as if it's getting flexible. People not knowing any better would think that it really is getting flexible and it's actually bending, but that's entirely an illusion. It has nothing to do with reality. It's all in your mind. Now, just holding it like this, you'll see that it gets so flexible that it actually appears to bend over to the untrained mind. And some people even swear that they see it turning at right angles and that eventually the two pieces of the spoon break into two pieces like that. I think that Martin Gardner and I probably got involved in the matter of investigating parapsychological and psychic and supernatural claims for about the same reason. We have a point of view of the magician. We know how people are fooled and how they fool themselves, which is even more important.
I've always been interested in offbeat science, and I don't know why, but when I was in high school, for example, I got involved in the creationist movement through books by a Seventh-day Adventist named George McCready Price, who wrote crank books attacking the theory of evolution. And it took me quite a while to figure out where he was wrong. And one of my early books is called Fads and Fallacies in the Name of Science. I think I wrote that in 1952. And it deals entirely with crank science.
This interest in crank science led to Martin's involvement in the investigation of alleged psychic phenomena, as in the case of Chicago bellhop Ted Serios, who claimed he could project his thoughts onto film.
The effect was, you bring your own Polaroid camera, you bring your own Polaroid film, you take a picture of him, he goes like this, and then something funny happens. You develop the Polaroid shot, and either it's a picture of me going like that and looking silly, but about, 4 or 5 times out of 100, it will be all black or all white, or a picture of a plane, or Cro-Magnon man, or a chair floating, some strange object.
Life magazine gave him 3 pages, big feature, with no intimation that there was any fraud going on. This was great psychic Ted Serios. So a group of us got together and tried to figure out how Ted Serios was doing it. A group led by Charlie Reynolds, who at that time was picture editor of Popular Photography. And Charlie Reynolds decided to interview Ted and take some pictures. I suggested to Charlie he take Percy along as an assistant because Percy was so knowledgeable about magic.
Sirios sometimes did the following. In order to focus the thought waves, he would take a piece of black paper and just put it on his forehead, and he called it the gizmo, and he would sort of point it toward the camera to focus. And sometimes I noticed that the little gizmo wasn't exactly on his forehead. In fact, sometimes it was right in front of the mouth of the camera.
So for an hour or two, absolutely nothing happened. They got nothing on Polaroid film. And they were watching very, very carefully. And at one point, at the end of the day, when everybody was tired and ready to go home, Percy saw Ted reach into his pocket and palm something out. And at that point, Percy said, "May we see what's in your hand, Ted?"
And I reached up and grabbed his hand. And then what's interesting is that a fist fight broke out, not between the two of us, but rather some of the PhDs who were there just said, "You can't do this. This is an experiment," stuff like that. And, but I had this death grip on his hand, and I wasn't letting go of it. He kind of stuffed his hand into his pocket and...
As Charlie Reynolds was to explain in his Popular Photography article, they believed that Ted Sirios had used a small tube fitted with lenses that allowed him to project onto film images that he had previously cut out of slides.
Well, I think an important thing to realize is that science is on a continuum with good science. Science everybody agrees is good science over at one end, and at the other end, crank science that everybody believes is crank. For example, nobody denies that a person who argues the earth is flat is doing reputable science. And in between is where the demarcation line gets very fuzzy and there are rooms for legitimate debate.
Now, your critics would say that you're not really being skeptical, that in fact you've already decided what is good science and what is pseudoscience.
In the case of parapsychology, for example, I'm open-minded. There may be something to parapsychology, but most experimental psychologists are waiting for some kind of really repeatable evidence that will prove the claims of the parapsychologists. And they've been working on this now for almost a century, and they still have not come up with an experiment that can be replicated. And the only explanation they give for the fact that that skeptics can't replicate their experiments is they say the skeptic's mind influences the experiment and causes negative results. So there's no way to argue against that. It just means that parapsychology will forever be in limbo with the parapsychologists getting positive results and the skeptics forever failing to replicate the experiment.
I often feel it's like fighting Hydra. There it is. I killed that. Ted Sirios. I published that, story that I told you in Science. And people are still writing parapsychology books saying, this irrefutable evidence of, Ted Sirios. And their line is this. They say, look, when you saw him, he cheated. So what? The other times, he didn't cheat. We had careful controls and stuff like that. And so, Martin, when I get tired, watching Martin's tireless efforts are an inspiration.
Perhaps what's most striking about Martin is his humility and his skepticism, both of which seem to be rooted in a deep feeling for life's mystery and the limits of our knowledge.
There are a lot of scientists who think that there's nothing really mysterious about the universe, and in just another century or so we'll solve all the problems of science. I belong to that group that thinks that we are very, very far from the frontier of knowing everything in science. And an Indian legend that I like, and I first ran across it in Carl Sandburg's book, The People Yes, where he repeats it. He says a white man drew a circle in the sand and said, "This is what the Indian knows." And then he drew another large circle, much larger than that, and he said, "This is what the white man knows." And the Indian took the stick and walked out about 100 yards and drew this gigantic circle and says, "This is where the Indian and white man know nothing."